Should I go? Okay. So changing course a little bit, I'm going to talk about the current account balance in China. But the model is going to be a dynastic model, so not as sophisticated as hers, but you're going to see lots of similarities. And it's joined with Jackie from University of Connecticut. So I'm going to show you a bunch of data that got us started to work on this project. This is the current account in China. It has increased a lot between 2004 and 2008, actually. So this period was a period where lots of papers got written about the current account surplus in China and what it implies for the US, for the world, the savings glut, that they cause the interest rates to go down to very low levels. And there are different types of papers that were written, so I'll give a little summary of that perhaps. But then it declined. Right now it's actually low, much lower than compared to this period of very high current account surpluses. And the two types of literature, and this is a very, very short list of the papers that have been done in this area. But the two types of work, this first group looks at differences between, say, emerging countries and developed countries in terms of their savings behavior, and perhaps differences in the financial markets in the two types of countries, or borrowing constraints that are causing high savings in one type of country versus low savings in the other type of country, and then causing these global flows to go in a particular way. A second set of papers look at China in particular. We are going to be in this set, so we're going to be looking at China in particular in just trying to understand the behavior of the current account in China in a lot of detail. Most of the papers that look at China also abstract from or focus on one thing at a time. So this current account surplus, of course, is composed of changes in a lot of things. It's changes in savings and investment. It's changes in different components of savings. So different papers are looking at different components. So for example, this first one looks at the transition in China from state-owned enterprises to more entrepreneurial firms, and state-owned enterprises do not face borrowing constraints, but the entrepreneurial firms face borrowing constraints. So when you're doing this transition, you're seeing that the savings in the corporate sector are going up because you're moving more towards companies that are facing borrowing constraints. So this one focuses more on the corporate savings part of the equation that determines the current account balance. This one looks at the household savings and the one-child policy and the impact of household savings on the current account. Many of these papers actually end around 2008, so they're mostly concerned about this increase in the current account surplus. So what we wanted to do in this paper was to sort of combine a lot of the things that we think could be important in determining this current account surplus into one model. And one of the reasons we wanted to do that is because we had written a paper on savings previously, and it was focused more on the household saving behavior. And when presenting that paper, we got a lot of comments that, well, maybe it was the corporate saving that mattered in China and not so much the household saving. Then we thought we should really look much deeper into that data. And also, as we started looking much deeper into that data, we realized that, well, the investment behavior in China seems to have been also changing, that maybe we should pay attention to, that the previous papers had not paid much attention to in trying to understand the current account balance in China. So I'm going to show you a bunch of graphs that show these components of the current account to motivate why we wanted to put everything together. So I'll start with saving and investment. So the blue line is the gross saving as a percent of GDP, and the red line is gross investment. As I mentioned, many papers were looking at this period of increasing current account surpluses, and these papers basically said, rightly so, that investment behavior or the investment wedge was kind of irrelevant during that period. It's pretty much smooth, and saving is going up. So they said, well, we can safely abstract from investment behavior and try to understand why their saving is going up. That it was true for that period, but actually it turns out that it's changed dramatically after that. So then, later period, what we're seeing is actually saving is pretty flat, but investment went up a lot. So then we thought, well, okay, let's figure out why investment went up. That's the reason behind the decline in the current account surplus. We want to know what happened.
It's a simple question. So the 50% is savings.
Yes.
1% is investment. So what is how do you define savings? So that we
saving is national saving rate as GDP minus consumption minus government expenditures. This is gross, so not depreciation taken out.
Minus consumption,
minus government, divided by GDP.
Okay.
Yeah, very high saving rates in China, of course. And I'm going to show you the components of it as well, household, government, and corporations, separated as well. But right now, this is the national saving rate. This graph is just to say that if you really want to understand the whole time period and why it went up and it went down, not only we want to understand the saving behavior, but also the investment. Yeah.
Isn't that by definition the difference between the two lines, the current account?
Yes.
So mechanically, how is that possible?
Mechanically, how is what possible?
That
the difference between the two is very large, so the current account surplus is very large, and the
investment is also on the right.
Yeah. Sorry. Measurement, yes. Yes. Both saving and investment are very high, yeah. Yeah, sorry, that's right. Left-hand side is the current account as a percent of GDP. Right-hand side is the other two, yeah. So then the next layer, which is the components of saving. So that's what I'm showing here. Now this data is from the flow of funds accounts. So this shows the corporate, household, and government saving. Same thing, left-hand side is now, I might have changed the axes just to confuse you, Victor. But the weird thing about the flow of funds data in China is that it gets revised a lot. So in the previous papers, when people talked about the importance of corporate savings, they used a lot of the old, at the time, they were using the information from flow of funds data, and there's many papers that you would find that would say that the corporate saving rate was increasing more than the household saving rate in China during the period of the current account surpluses. But actually the current data, what it is showing is that the blue line is the corporate saving rate, and it had increased quite a bit in this period leading up to 2004. But during the period of this very high surpluses or increasing surpluses, the corporate saving rate was relatively stable, whereas the household saving rate was increasing. So, as well as, of course, the government saving rate, right? So the yellow line is the government, red line is household, blue line is corporate. So, as a result, we want to have in the model the distinction between corporate, household, and government saving, especially since in the past, people focused quite a bit on the corporate saving rate in China. We thought this should be incorporated in a model that tries to understand this behavior. Now, again, the papers that were saying that the increase in the corporate saving rate was very important in understanding the Chinese current account surplus, is now being questioned a bit for another reason, and that reason is in this graph. So here what I'm showing is the corporate investment, corporate saving rates, and the external financing that corporations in China do as a % of GDP. So, so they are actually net borrowers all throughout this period in China. Corporations have been net borrowers. This isn't necessarily true for some other countries. So for example, we know Microsoft puts a lot of money in outside the US, for tax purposes. There's a lot of increase in corporate savings in many countries, including the US. And some of these countries corporations are net savers. Here, actually, corporations are net borrowers. So looking at this data, we were more convinced that we should be looking at the household sector in more detail than the corporate sector, but the corporate sector needs to be present, especially to understand the investment behavior, because the investment behavior changed quite a bit. And reading the papers about why the investment behavior has changed quite a bit has led us to conclude that the government, after the Great Recession, changed a lot of the financial constraints that both the different provinces are facing and the firms are facing. So there has been a change in the financial frictions in China we thought would be important to model. So you're going to see a model that's going to try to put a lot of things in, but still, abstract from other important things probably, but going to try to put a lot of things on the household side, to put focus on the household saving rate. We're going to put financial frictions on the firm side to make sure that we can get at least some of the investment behavior and try to make a sense of this data. So the household side is going to be these dynastic households where the parents and the kids love each other. No strategic behavior. They're going to combine their incomes and make the joint consumption decision. They're going to, that was one of the reasons I was asking about the relative incomes of the parents and the children. So this is China, right? So there's a lot of family insurance that's going on in China that I'm sure in the US data we are not capturing to some extent, because what's happening in China is that, so there are all these risks that, of course, that they exist in the US as well, but there's a lot less insurance in China for old age risks especially. So in terms of healthcare and in terms of Social Security, it's nowhere close to the US levels. So here, the importance of family insurance is something that we had looked at in the previous paper that we're going to bring into this model. And the corporate sector is going to be composed of firms that are like entrepreneurial firms. But usually in these models of entrepreneurial firms, people would have like one regular sector and then an entrepreneurial sector that face borrowing constraints. Instead, we are going to simplify that. We are going to say there's one set of firms that are held by a fraction of households. They all face borrowing constraints. So in fact, when you look into the data, even the Songstores, Letten, Zibelotti paper that I mentioned, they do say that even the state-owned enterprises, in reality, they do face borrowing constraints. Even though they're kind of less borrowing constraint than the entrepreneurial firms, and the transition makes a difference, we're going to abstract from that. We're going to say all firms will face borrowing constraints, but we will calibrate this borrowing constraint so that we match the overall external funding that is used by Chinese firms, and it's going to be a fraction of households that own these firms, and therefore they are going to be the ones that will enjoy the high returns of the productivity that comes from these firms. Yes?
So the SOEs are in the what?
All the firms, all the production is taking place in this set of firms. Yes, so there's no distinction between the two types of firms. So at the end, this sector is we're going to do our best to use this borrowing constraint just to get the investment behavior right. Okay. This allows us to do one more thing, which is many people say that in China, normal households, they're not able to get the high return to capital, which is going to be the case here. So households are not at least all the households are going to be able to get the high return to capital. Entrepreneurial households will. They will be getting the high return to capital. And there will be a bank. This bank will basically hold all the savings of all the households and entrepreneurs and the government. But there will be borrowing constraints that the firms are facing, so they will be channeling some of those savings to the domestic firms that become investment. The rest goes to deposits at the world interest rate. So in that sense, this part of the model is very similar to other papers that looked at the entrepreneurial choice. It's just that it's all happening in one type of firm instead of two types of firms. So the household side is the more interesting side in the sense that we think it's the increase in the household saving rate that is really important in understanding the increase in the total national saving rate. So this part is going to be rich, much richer than the corporate sector. And as I mentioned, it's the dynastic framework where everybody loves each other.
So what's the inner equilibrium notion that you're using?
I mean, at the
Is there any price that gets determined?
the marginal product of capital is going to be determined. So the return that the entrepreneurs get from their firm is going to be the marginal product of capital, and that's going to be in a general equilibrium determination. So there's a world interest rate that the banks will give to the depositors, and the lending rate will equal that. So the world interest rate will equal the deposit rate and the lending rate, but the entrepreneurs will earn the marginal product of capital, which is higher than any of those rates.
Okay, so
And that will be determined.
How do I think it happens that you're going to backward engineer the size of the constraint to make sense of what they do?
Yes.
So in a sense, the equilibrium is residual, isn't it? To say, if this is the constraint, even that the risk-free interest rate is say 1%.
Right.
The model will tell you how big are the financing problems that they have to be facing.
Right.
So that all they invest the maximum they could borrow.
Exactly. And it's going to change over time. That borrowing constraint is going to change over.
That's sort of completely residual. So
Yes.
So you're saying my model will tell me nothing about how much is invested. It will tell me how much problems would have had to be so that they invested what they did invest.
Exactly. So it's going to exactly. So that's what I mean by the corporate sector is not terribly interesting. This exogenous borrowing constraint is going to determine their investment behavior. But I can give you reasons to why in the data the borrowing constraint seems to have changed, and I can do some predictions about if it goes back to the old levels, counterfactuals. So on the household side, it's like Corina's paper. It's the parents and the children living together in a household. There are no grandparents, so it's not 3 generations. And once the children have their own kids, they form their own household. But everybody, people care about the entire dynasty, of course, discounted to some extent. But the bite here, the importance here, is that there's a bunch of health-related risks that the parents face that the kids will insure them for. So, well, actually, let me start with the kids or the working age people. They do face labor income risks because in China, that has been discussed that, of course, after the 80s, before the 80s, there were no income risk. Basically, everybody was employed by the state. After the 80s, there has been an increase in the income risk, so that should be included, people thought, in a model for China. So that's the income risk that the labor, working age people will be facing. But then parents are going to face these health-related risks. In general, I think, I'm thinking more of, we could have modeled more of the medical risks that they face, but we're focusing on this long-term care risk because that's the one that really needs their children to help them with. So a long-term care need is a need where the parent is really in need of someone who can help them in the house. We've seen even from the US data, like Maria Christina's work, that this long-term care risk is an important component of the savings of the retirees in the US. In China, there is really no help to them. It's increasing, the help that's provided by the government is increasing, but for the time period we're looking at, it's really minimal. So it really needs the time cost and the goods cost to time cost of the children to take care of the parents, and then there's some goods cost that comes with it that we're going to calibrate to the Chinese data. The thing that happened in the time period that we're looking at that makes this important is that in 1980, China passed the one-child policy. So by, say, 2000, you have many, many Chinese families who have only one child. So if one adult child marries another adult, now they have 4 elderly parents to take care of. So this is a big exogenous shock to the family insurance that used to exist in China, during which time they passed laws that would say visit the family or visit the parents laws, because they were getting into trouble with the decrease in the family insurance. And that is going to be a very important part of our story for the increase in the household saving rate in China. So this is going to be all captured through this long-term care risk that the Chinese families face. And part of that interaction you can see in the earnings of the household. So what you have here is the economy-wide wage rate, age earnings profile, uncertainty, income uncertainty while working, number of children. If the parent is sick, age is equal to 1, then this amount of time has to be devoted to taking care of the parent. And then this is the income of the parent, the economy-wide wage rate, the age earnings profile, whether or not the parent is sick or not, can work or not, and then they pay Social Security taxes. This is before the parent is retired, this is after the parent is retired, and this is the Social Security income that the parent will receive. D indicates whether or not the parent is alive or deceased. So if D is equal to 0, the parent has died and no income is received. So I'm going to show you the maximization problem, the whole budget constraint, but this is going to be the earnings that applies to all sorts of families in this economy, both the entrepreneurial families and the worker families. So the entrepreneurial families are going to be some omega fraction, so that omega is also going to be calibrated to match the investment ratios. Did you have a question? No. In the previous paper, we had not endogenous, but exogenous differences in the human capital of the parent and the children. And that was another reason why so in China, children are now richer than their parents on average, whereas I think in the US it might be the opposite. So the kind of transfers that take place is different. So when the parents are poorer than their children, the children do end up giving them money. In the US we wouldn't be observing that because parents are pretty wealthy compared to their children. Here we abstracted from that. It didn't seem to matter too much. So the entrepreneur, this is the entire production is going to be taking, it will be happening in this set of families who are owning the firms. They are going to receive the profits of the firms, and the firm profit maximization will determine how much to borrow, basically. So what is important here is the loans that they borrow at the rate RL. In equilibrium, this is going to be the same as the deposit rate. We're not going to assume any financial banking sector will be totally without any cost. So deposit rate will equal the lending rate. This is something one can play around. So this is total production, depreciation, labor costs, and the costs for how much they've lent, how much they've borrowed. And there will be an incentive compatibility constraint, but we will assume that they will end up, so the return to capital from the entrepreneurial firm will be higher than any of the interest rates in the economy, so they're going to borrow the maximum amount that they can borrow in this economy. So from which we will get the amount of loans that they're going to get for any asset that they've decided to save, which comes from the...
It's the opposite. That's where you get the ETA from.
We will calibrate the ETA to get the external funds to match. Yes, that's right. So maybe there's a better way to say that here. So entrepreneurial families are going to be maximizing this joint utility function. So N again is the number of children, then utility of the children after the consumption tax of tau C. D again shows whether or not the parent is alive or not, and then the consumption of the B said sons and fathers, and then the continuation value. Subject to this joint budget constraint, I had shown you the E, that is the labor earnings, but then on the left-hand side you have how much they save, how much is the consumption of the kids, parent, whether or not there's medical expenditures, assets, and then profits that come from the firm. And then this kappa is actually going to be quite important. This is going to determine what happens to the most destitute in China. So as it is important in the models for the US, whether or not, so in China they call them 4 no's. So people who have no children, who have no income, who have no house, who have no job, if they get sick, what happens to them? In the US, there is a lot of government-provided insurance, I mean, a lot compared to China. Not that it's good compared to China. So this kappa will determine the minimum consumption guaranteed to people who are in desperate need. And this is a very important, of all the things that I showed you, this probably is very important, the most important one in determining the saving rate of the households. And I'll show you how that affects things. Worker families are very similar. They just don't have the profits. But we also realize that, so there's one complication here, and this can change. The paper is just finished yesterday, so we're still thinking of how to better model it. But in the Chinese data, you have investment of the corporations, but there's also a sizable fraction of household investment that has its own category in the flow of funds data, which gave us the impression that it wasn't even the worker families. Some of them, a fraction of them, might get higher returns than what the deposit rate is. So the way we've modeled it so far is that we are saying, so this part is the same, savings, consumption of the son, number of children, parent, medical expenditures. On the right-hand side, though, we wanted to distinguish between the assets that earn this very low return, the deposit rate return, but also some fraction that we will match to the household investment data that we see in China will actually earn the high return. This is the marginal product of capital, this high return that we observe from the firm's profit maximization problem. When we read about this household investment that's in the Chinese data, it sounds like small family enterprises. So in some ways, it sounds like the maybe entrepreneurial families, but maybe not. So we weren't sure if we should lump them together into the firm or separate them. So far, what you're going to see is that we just made them earn a little bit of the higher profit.
Where does that show up in NIPA? And the other one is, what about it? Isn't this all house like a big chunk of what happened? There's a colossal appreciation of the value of land.
You mean in the data?
So first of all, that thing, where does it show up in NIPA?
So in the Chinese flow funds accounts.
In the NIPA of the model, where is that?
In the NIPA of our model, we are going to, so the savings of the worker households are going to get a slightly higher return than just what the bank is giving them. They're owning the, what do you mean where it's coming from? So it's the,
Generated by some chunk of the economy. If all capital is in the hands of the rich, they have to think of a way to make this.
so they have like the stock, so some of it is like the stock on the firm.
But all the firm was in the only that has the fraction of
Right. So you're saying when we add up to the capital stock, where do we show?
You have to make sure.
Yeah. It's somewhere. Right.
The thing isn't that part of, if you want to make sense of the historical thing, isn't that all these people are buying land and the price of land is going up the roof?
In the data, that's not what they claim that it is. The household investment that they don't say it's the land. They say it's this, agricultural production. So maybe it's the rural families that are investing in some of the agricultural.
So
I don't think we have it like that in the U.S. flow of funds. I mean, we don't separate. So I wasn't
is
sure.
the value of land going up during this period?
Yes, but I don't think that's what they mean by household investment.
So then how does your modeling think of land? Is there like a...
It's not there. Land is not there. No.
But the flow of funds has the value of land, doesn't it? It's a T account, isn't that the T account of the household sector and it has a capital gain?
I need to look at that. Yeah. How do they do the flow? Maybe that's why they keep revising it. Yeah, I'll check. Okay. Government. So government is going to look similar to how we usually model government, but we are actually playing around with something that's different than what we normally do. So normally what we do is we take the taxes, we take the expenditures, the difference we give back somehow to the people. So one of the things that gets mentioned a lot about China is that the government has a lot of savings and that they're actually saving that money on US Treasury bills. So in the version that I'm going to show you, there is going to be a surplus that will get created in this model from the taxes and G that are exogenously, tax rates are exogenously taken, G to GDP is exogenously taken. There will be a surplus, and we will let them save that surplus in a bank account, just to see if we can capture, that path that I showed you about the government savings. So that's kind of different than how we usually write down the government's budget constraint, but I think it makes more sense in the case of China because we keep hearing that they do buy the UST bills. So we're going to start from some initial state, go to some future state, but we're really interested in the transition. So we're doing from 1980 to 2014, and we are going to put in a bunch of the exogenous variables and then see what comes out. So the exogenous variables are going to be these and maybe a few others, but the most important thing, at least for the behavior of investment. What is going to be important is this borrowing constraint. This is something, I mean, I don't think I ever solved these models with entrepreneurship, but it turns out that the constraint that you put on the firm on how much they can borrow, this is going to vary somewhere between 40 and 50%, and it's going to matter quite a bit for investment. So maybe this is typical in entrepreneurship models, but this is the one that we are exogenously calculating to match the external funds used by Chinese firms. That's what we were talking about before. On the household side, on the savings side, also from our previous paper, we know that this one-child policy mattered a lot. So we are going to put in the one-child policy. Initial steady state, they're allowed to have 4 children per couple. One-child policy, when they imposed it in 1980, it's a very strict policy, but it's different between urban and rural areas, and there has also been violations to it, even though it's very, very strict. So we are going to take the actual fertility rate that ended up happening in China, which is higher than 1 child per person. It's a combination of rural and urban population plus the violations. Even though I think, so the saving rate that comes out of the model, the household saving rate that comes out of the model is very sensitive to how many children they can have. And I'm going to show you experiments with this. The saving rate, not maybe so much the current account, but the saving rate definitely is. And even though we are calibrating to the actual fertility rate, in China there actually is a very important distinction between the kids who are born into families who did not follow the rules. So they actually are not able to register them for many things like health insurance, for schooling their problems. So we are abstracting from those things, which I think in reality is as if the fertility rate is smaller than this. So the amount of family insurance might actually be smaller than the one we are imposing in the model. We've also taken, especially in the first paper, and then carried it over to this paper, the amount of labor productivity by age, from people who worked with the data sets in China, as well as the labor income risk that existed since the 80s. So those are included in the model. Another issue is how much Social Security there is in China. If you look at an OECD publication that compares countries' replacement rates, you would see a very high replacement rate for China. But it really masks the fact that only a very small fraction of people get that very high Social Security replacement rate. So it's almost non-existent for the rural area. Social Security is almost non-existent. I mean, it's starting now. They're expanding it tremendously. But for the time period we're worried about, it's almost non-existent. Even in the cities, only 40 to 50% of the people get the replacement rate that is being published in the OECD publication. So when you aggregate, when you're looking at an average person, when you take a weighted average of rural versus urban and who gets it, who doesn't get it, it comes out to be a very small number. So the Social Security replacement rate is going to be 15%. The reason I stress this is because the savings behavior is going to be very much affected by the decline in family insurance and the lack of government insurance. So I'm going to tell you that in the future, I expect the government insurance to be going up because they keep talking about it. Chinese government is in a mission to reduce poverty, help the poor, increase Social Security. All of these things really give you predictions about what's going to happen to household saving rates in the future. And then that will have implications on the current account balance in China. For the rate of return on foreign bonds, we took the real interest rate implied by the US T-bills. Although, I'm not sure if that's the best thing to do either, because while the government might be saving on US Treasury bills, I don't think the typical Chinese household gets that return. In the model right now, everybody's getting the same return. So this is something we'll play around with probably. And then the share of entrepreneurial families, it's to match the capital output ratio. So this is the part that I was talking about, you know, we solved the model, we solved this ETA, the financial constraints, such that the benchmark model gives us a reasonable amount of external funds that were happening in China. The reason I show this graph, another reason I show it is because so there's a lot of variation over time, and especially this period, there's a big increase in the external funds, and we're modeling it as a decline in financial constraints that causes increase in external funds. But from all the things that we read, it is the stimulus plan that the Chinese government started after the Great Recession. But the way they did it was by relaxing. I mean, in fact, they created a lot of off-balance sheet items. Yeah.
I'm not getting it clear. Let me see if I can. You chose the ETA to replicate the path of investment.
A path of external funds.
Oh, so that's external funds.
External funds
So
that
that's just a mild degree of incompetence on your part for not getting exactly right. Because you want to get that exactly right. That's a little bit odd.
No, there's a reason why we can't get it exactly right.
Not because you targeted investment, and given how these other parts of the model are working, it has the right prediction about the external funds. That's what I thought.
If we targeted investment, you mean?
I thought we were targeting investment, and then to replicate that, given the path of productivity, this is what it implies about.
I see.
External fund, and then it's beautiful.
No, right. It's not that. We are targeting the external funds and then looking at investment. We're doing the opposite, right? And why doesn't it match exactly? I think there's a reason, but I can't tell you right now. But then, you know, we're going to look at investment. I mean, we could have done the opposite. I think that trying to see if
showing the model is good to see what you didn't target. Say, look, this is.
Oh yeah. I'm going to show you investment and everything. Of course. This is still under calibration, basically. I also wanted to show you the TFP growth rate that gets fed into this model. The red one is the one we have calculated. The blue one is the Penn World tables. I like mine more, so we used mine. Yeah.
How did the stimulus package plan help the sort of financing of firms in China?
Say it again.
How did the stimulus plan that the government put in place help increase the external financing of firms?
So there are a few very good papers about this. I don't know if I'm going to do justice in explaining them. So the Chinese government, the federal government, created these off-balance sheet items where they allowed the provincial governments to extend credit to a large sector of their economies with, you know, less constraints, is my understanding of what the Chinese government did. The amount of money the initial amount of money that they allocated for this purpose, if it is not wrong, is like 10% of their GDP. It's just a giant amount of money. So it turns out that even like Krugman was writing about it, because China had devoted much more money than the US did. And from my understanding of reading this literature, it seems like, you know, they were really encouraging growth of credit taken by other, you know, firms in these provinces. So we're doing a very, you know, exogenous thing in implementing it. You know, none of that richness is here, obviously. Okay. Now, in our previous paper where we looked at the household saving rate, We spent a lot of time trying to understand if this is a good economy. We looked at a bunch of things, that are calibrated and that are not calibrated, including inter-vivos transfers, age saving profiles, some of the comparisons with the microdata, families with twins versus families without twins. I'm going to spare you all the details of that, but we were convinced that this is not a bad model, given that it's a giant economy we're trying to summarize. But instead, let me show you what comes out of the benchmark model. This is, the blue line is the data for the current account. The red line is what comes out of the model as the current account. What we want to do with this is to see, what are the main causes. So it really misses things here. But we want to see what made it go up, what made it go down. What is it in the model that is causing these things? Let me show you also the two components, the saving rate and the investment rate that come out of the model and compared to the data. So this is the national saving rate, not the components, but the national saving rate. It captures the increase, but not so much this later period and also not so much the earlier period. And then this is the investment rate. So matching the external funds, how much of the investment. I haven't really decided if this is good or bad yet, but so there are things that obviously it's missing. But in this framework, I want to see the role of two important things that, after doing all the counterfactuals, now we know these two are the important ones. It's the implementation of the one-child policy and financial frictions. So I'm going to show you a case where if they hadn't implemented the one-child policy, so if they hadn't implemented the one-child policy, then we don't know what would have happened to the fertility rate, obviously, and it's not a model of endogenous fertility. But we're going to just exogenously assume something and see what that does. It's going to gradually decline at a constant rate and then go to the replacement rate in 2050. So what this one-child policy does, as I mentioned before, it really gets rid of the family insurance. It really makes it much harder to have family insurance. And in the face of these risks, like health-related risks, people have to have private savings. So private savings or household savings go up just to compensate for the lack of family insurance. So if saving goes up, if you remember in the period between 2004 and 2008, I was showing you that it was the increase in savings that was causing the high current account surpluses. So if you solve the model with a much more family insurance, the shape stays similarly, but the size of the current account surplus is much smaller. And this is all coming from the savings behavior. So they would have saved much less, and therefore the current account surplus would have been much less. In fact, this is how much less they would have saved if they had family insurance. So this is not recalibrated to start from the same level, so that's why they're not starting from the same level. But if there was no one-child policy, you don't have the slope. This is something we have in fact figured out in our previous paper, that what happens by 2000 is that you have more and more families with only one child by year 2000, right? The whole thing, one-child policy starts in 1980, but it has a big bite starting in 2000 because this family income, that's a combination of the wages of both the parents and the parent and the children, that gets a big hit starting in 2000. So this is what this is showing you, that the big spike in the current account surplus would have been much less if family insurance were continuing at its previous rate. Now, of course, I also had a graph for investment, but this doesn't change investment behavior, the one-child policy, so I didn't put the graph in here. Instead, let me do a counterfactual where the financial constraints is different. So this is what we had in the benchmark. We did it so that we match the external funds. Suppose we don't do it, suppose we keep the borrowing constraints constant along the transition and see what happens. It's this thing that you get. So there's something weird that I should mention. So this black line is with a constant eta. So this still fluctuates a lot. And the reason this fluctuates a lot is that in the background, there is a rate of return on T-bills, US T-bills, that the savers are getting, and that fluctuates a lot. It's not TFP. I initially thought it was TFP. No, it's the fluctuating T-bill rate from the US. And in fact, at this date, it's I think 2008 or 9, that the US rate is spiking for some reason. Like the inflation rate turns out to be, so these are the real rates. So inflation turns out to be negative or something, and I looked at many different real rates actually. So that's another, I'm not sure how good a representation of the Chinese saving behavior it is to say that everybody gets the US T-bill rate, but it does cause some things to happen. But nevertheless, this big increase that we see disappears. This is the Chinese stimulus plan, not existing basically. And we see a decline in investment. And more importantly, the current account behavior. Now again, this spike is coming from the US T-bill rate, but I think what this says is that the trend would have been for the current account to be increasing if the Chinese government had not done the stimulus plan, which made the investment go up, right? So investment would not have increased as much, and the current account would have kept at a high level. Maybe another way to show that is just to do some counterfactuals about the future. Okay, so I'm going to just briefly show you.
Before that,
Yeah.
Big spike of the trade surplus was a combination of this relatively limited reduction of the birth rate started in 1980 that implied a huge saving because of these family reasons.
Yes.
And the only reason why it ended is that somehow the Chinese government managed to reduce the borrowing constraints of firms.
Yes.
That's the punchline I should
Yes.
take
Yes.
from here.
Yes.
And that is why there's going to be a delayed period because fertility moves very, very slowly of an almost 7 rate unless the new insurance policy of
Yes.
the government kick in fast.
Yes. 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 So that's why I want to do the future, because I know in the future there are things that they're changing. Right? So far, I've assumed Social Security replacement of 15%. I know they're expanding it. So I'm going to show you an experiment with like what happens to current account if they do that. So let me actually just show you that. Let me show you that. So this is now going forward. Okay, 2014 to the future. Red line is the benchmark model. So if they didn't do anything, we are at like 5-6%. This is what it's going to continue at. If they increase the Social Security replacement rate from 15% to 30%, which is the experiment I did in here, you have a much lower current account deficit, a surplus. That's because savings is going to react quite dramatically to changes in government policy. So similar things happen if you increase the income that goes to the most destitute. There's a C minimum consumption level that the government is providing. They're also talking about that. So as I mentioned before, they're in a big mission of poverty reduction. So if that includes something for these healthcare risks that the most destitute face, you would see a similar thing happening. Okay, so the changes in their social policies would make me think that the current account surplus is going to shrink. On the other hand, the changes that might happen on the borrowing constraint side, so I'm kind of convinced that the increase in investment was due to this relaxation of borrowing constraints that they really did at a very large scale over many years. That will end at some point, but it's very long lasting, it seems. So the initial stimulus plan was in 2008. So I read papers that in 2017 that still, this is still continuing. So who knows how long that would continue. But if they were to increase the borrowing constraints back to its pre-recession levels, then we would see a big increase in the current account surplus again, because investment would go down to the pre-recession levels. Now, which one of these things, what will happen here, I have no idea. I have an idea on what's happening in here because they keep talking about the future of Social Security and medical insurance, so it's easier to imagine that they would work in this direction. They also recently got rid of their one-child policy, went into a two-child policy. We don't find very big effects of that for the future of the current account. But I still have to understand this experiment. It came to me yesterday. And I have 0 minutes left, so I will just end with this, that at least the things that we know that they're doing on the Social Security part would give us the implication that the future current account surpluses are going to be smaller in China. That I will end. I'm standing between food and